So the record has been started, and now I'm handing back over to Michaela.
Yeah, welcome again to the webinar on system and/or behavior change from Stay Grounded. I will now make a short introduction and talk a bit about the agenda and the guests who will be giving inputs today. I think we have a quite interesting agenda today. Yeah, my name is Michaela Leitner. I'm a campaigner based in Vienna, and I'm working for the new Let's Stay Grounded campaign of the network Stay Grounded. I'm also a sociologist, and therefore the question of the relation between individual behavior and system change is something that I've stumbled upon quite frequently. So yeah, I will just start with an introduction now. So I think something we can all agree on is that in times of climate emergency, system change is necessary. In the end, system change means collective behavior change, but not only one individual by one individual, but on a societal level. But collective behavior change is only possible if also our institutions, economy, and rules and culture change. So it's much more than just individuals changing themselves. And the question now is, which strategies are the best to achieve systemic change? I think that's what we all are thinking about a lot. And it could be lobbying or petitioning for new regulations. It could be pressuring institutions or corporations. It could be by actions or manifestations, or by targeting individuals' consumption directly. So it could also be a combination of all these different strategies, and the question is, how could they be combined? Which would be also plausible, since society does consist of many different elements and layers, so many different strategies might be advisable. So I think this question is very important for our movement against the growth of aviation, as you can also see by the high interest in the webinar, because it informs our strategies and also our different approaches that we choose in our campaigns. We won't find the right answer or the right strategy in our webinar. That won't be possible. There are also many different models and theories that you can apply regarding system change or and in campaigns. But we will discuss two main approaches today, one that is coming more from environmental psychology and one from sociology. And yeah, we have two guests today, and I will also show you the agenda now. One moment, I have to start my presentation. So I hope you can see it now. Yeah, this is the agenda, and also you can see our guests. After my introduction, that we will have an input from Vivian. She is an environmental psychologist at the Technische Universität Berlin and the Institute for Ecological Economy Research. She is also active at the Initiative Psychology of Environmental Protection and Wandelwerk. And she will talk today about reasons of why we continue to fly and how to change it. The second input will be from Lars Petersen. He is an environmental sociologist and a senior researcher at the Department of Environmental Science at Aarhus University in Denmark. He deals with sustainable development and transition, behavior change, and works with the theory of social practices. And in his speech, he will also talk about the approach of this theory of social practices, its critique of some theories focusing on individuals, and also will name some examples of campaigns addressing social practices. You will always be able to ask questions after the inputs, and after discussing the inputs, I will make a short overview about our Let's Stay Grounded campaign, the new campaign we are starting right now, where we try to combine different approaches to systemic change as just one concrete example. But there are also, of course, many other possible examples in different ways to systemic change. And in the last half hour of the webinar, we are very looking forward to your input and your sharing your campaign strategies and theories of change with us. So I think now we can start with the input from Vivian. Yeah. Vivian, please share your screen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to talk about this topic because in environmental psychology, I always try and push the topic of flying. So I'm quite glad I can finally also even talk about it for 20 minutes. So that's nice, thank you. As you already said, my topic today is why we fly and how to change it, hopefully, and I will take the perspective of environmental psychology. First, a little bit of what you already know, just to get you in the mood. Flying has been called the fastest and cheapest way to increase your CO2 footprint, so very efficient. And flying has also been increasing globally, and maybe another important aspect of this is that it is also a topic that is a lot about inequality. So a very small percentage of global population has been on a plane before. So it is a typical environmental behavior where you see that the rich are taking advantage and the poor are suffering from it, to say it very plainly. And this is why I also wanted to show in the beginning of this course the donut model that you might know, that shows the environmental boundaries, but also the social boundaries that we have when we behave ourselves environmentally friendly or not. So the goal of sustainability is to keep our consumption within limits, both for the environment and for other people as well. So this is, I think flying is just a really good case that shows also social disparities. And I found this photo recently that I really like. It's also about like mass tourism. So some cities now are even suffering from, you know, the whole amount of people flying around with EasyJet and clogging cities. So that I found this one very nice to show in the beginning. But now let's start with the environmental psychology part of things. So what we often look at here is that we look at whether attitudes toward a behavior and the behavior itself are connected. So the question would be, do people who think that flying is bad actually stop flying? In more general terms, when you look at environmental behaviors, there's some behaviors that can be very well explained by having like feeling that yourself, you're an environmentally friendly person. So people who think they are environmentally friendly, they take shorter showers, they buy more organic products, they buy energy-saving devices, and they eco-drive. So they, when they drive, they try to use less fuel. So these are examples of behaviors that are well predicted by the attitude, whereas you have other behaviors that are not predicted by an environmental identity, but on the contrary, the more people say they are environmentally friendly, the more flights they take, the more energy they use, and the bigger their CO2 footprint. So here you already see that these things are not linked, but then in this study that I'm showing right now, there has been another factor explaining these three things quite well, which is income, which you could maybe guess. So it looks like a high socioeconomic status plainly sometimes leads to more consumption. So it looks like there is a high motivation to engage in these behaviors, and the limiting factor seems to be whether people are able to show this behavior. On the other hand, what we also see is there is a lot of environmental conscience around flying. So I found this statistic, sorry that it's half in German, but I will translate the important thing is not the age that is described, but just to see that like the majority of people actually have a bad conscience when they fly, whether you find this good or not. But so there is a lot of awareness already that flying as an individual behavior is problematic. So then researchers started to find out, why is this so? Why do people think flying is bad, but in the end they still go for trips? And I think all of us have our individual stories, especially when we're one of those people who stopped flying and have like lunch conversations about it. You will find what I present now, like it will look familiar to you. So this was an interview study that was done that looked at what people, like what do people change when they see that flying or when they perceive flying as an environmentally bad behavior. There are 4 types of reactions. The smallest, by far the smallest reaction was actually stopping to fly. in this interview. Then there were people who reduced or restricted flying. So they were like, yeah, okay, maybe only once a year or something. And then there were others who compensated their flying behavior. So they were like, they said something along the lines of, okay, but I eat vegetarian, I use my car less, and so on. But the majority of people also showed some kind of justification. So they, instead of changing the actual behavior, they, for example, said things like, well, everyone is doing it, or my individual behavior does not make a difference. Especially also this system argument that the system has to change, but they as individuals don't make a difference. So things like that. And all these four types of reactions can be seen as, are explained by the cognitive dissonance theory. Sorry, yeah. So the cognitive dissonance says if you perceive that you have an attitude and it does not fit your behavior, you will either change the behavior or change something about your attitude in order not to feel this dissonance, this inner tension in yourself. So that is the theory behind that, and we will get to it later. Now I would just like you to reflect for yourself a few minutes before I dig into the different barriers towards not flying from an individual perspective. Maybe you take like 10 seconds or so to just like note for yourselves, or I don't know if you want to take notes or just remember a few points why you think people still continue to fly, and which are the main barriers that you think personally are the most influential. So I'll just give you like 10 seconds to think about this, and I'll be quiet in that time. Okay, so now I will, like informed by psychological research, I will show you a few barriers towards staying grounded, and maybe you can see if you like thought the same thing, or maybe later you want to add some additional stuff. So the first, I call them hurdle, as in a behavioral barrier that makes it more difficult to show non-flying behavior in this case. The first one that is quite obvious are what we call psychologist situational factors. And in this case, it would be the availability and price. So maybe you've heard about the marshmallow experiment. It's a very famous experiment in psychology where you present, for example, kids, but also adults, you present them something they really like, they really think is tasty or nice. And then you measure their willpower. How well do they do in not showing this behavior? And so what you see is that having this really, also through online booking, having the availability to book flights anytime and for a really cheap price can seem like a temptation that is there all the time. And of course we know that prices and availability of flights are due to like not paying the external price of this product. So when you actually ask people if they think that flying is too cheap, interestingly, more than half of the people actually say, yes, flying is too cheap, it should be more expensive. So that is an interesting side fact that I found. So staying with these situational factors that we find, it is not only that you can just find flights very cheaply, but it is also the context in which we live. So you have a political and economic context that that always sees economic growth as something positive, which I show here in a comic, which says what we need at this stage is to increase our consumption. This is what we often hear in the media or from people telling us that we need this for a good life. And in fact, what you see is that many of us are already oversaturated with consuming. And here you again see this cognitive dissonance that when you ask people, do you think for the environment it is good to fly or not? It is clear that they say, no, I think it's not good. But on the other hand, there are a lot of narratives around that just show how society also says other things are valuable and are good to do. Then we get to the second hurdle. This is now more like the moral motive people have. So you have a problem awareness, and a sense of emergency that you have when you encounter environmentally not friendly behavior. So what we see, in psychology, what we measure is the personal norm, which is a feeling of personal obligation to behave in a certain way. So that would be for us to think, okay, flying is really not so nice, so I won't do it. That is like the moral obligation that people feel. And what has been found, especially in climate research, is that if you have a psychological distance to the consequences of your behavior, then it gets really hard for people to maintain this kind of sense of emergency, of urgency, and this problem awareness. And we see this psychological distance, especially if you have like the consequences are far away in time. So depending on which source you believe, climate change or the bad implications of climate change are still a few years away. Then you have the space dimension, where you see that the worst climate change problems will probably hit somewhere else and not in the countries that fly the most. And then you have also the issue of social proximity, where you also see that this inequality is actually working against us. So the very rich don't actually see as many consequences from the very poor people, as if segregation of population continues, and if you have this globalized system of production and consumption. And in the end, of course, you also have, with this whole climate change issue, you always have these, like the scientists often communicate in a way of probability, and it has been found in psychological research that people do not deal well with probability. Like it is hard to then feel a sense of urgency when you say, yeah, we have a so-and-so % chance that the temperature might rise in this range. So it's hard to imagine. So this is also a problem in many, not only in flying, but in many environmental behaviors, that the farther away the consequences, the harder it gets for oneself to maintain a motivation to behave sustainably. Then, as a third hurdle, we also have conflicting goals and wants, and of course, advantages of consuming. We often take this for granted, but it is actually interesting to reflect on it. There were studies in general for consuming and not consuming. People were asked, what are your reasons to consume? And what are your reasons to not consume? And it was interesting that they are not the opposite of each other. But when you ask for reducing consumption, people come up with these moral reasons that we just had. Like, I want to protect the environment, I want to build a better future, and I know that our resources are limited. That is why I am engaging in this behavior. But when you ask people the other way around, what is for you a motivation to not reduce, then suddenly all these things come up, like, I want to keep my current lifestyle, I want to have an easy and comfortable life, I like my short-term rewards, which you of course have when you can just fly over to, I don't know, Rome for a weekend. For some people that is very nice. And some also trust in technology, like they think there will be a future solution, and I don't know, maybe we suck CO2 out of the air, or there will be something. And many also say they don't have the capacity, so they don't have the time to worry about these things. So just to look a little bit more on these needs and wants that people have, there are a lot of them, but I just filtered out a few that I find really important when you look at flying. One is that in our consumer society nowadays, consumer goods and services are not only something that you fulfill your basic needs with, so not something that keeps you like healthy and sheltered and everything, but it is also something that defines yourself. So through your consumption, you show to others and to yourself which kind of person you are. So for example, if you're someone who flies around a lot, maybe you're a very cosmopolitan person and you are very open-minded, and also. So we will get to this, back to this later when we talk about narratives that build around the traveling, like the picture we have of traveling. So that would be identity. And then you have also something like social acceptance. So there is something we call conspicuous consumption. So the way you consume can also like show to others how well off you are, but then it has also been shown that to increase your own well-being, it's not so important how high your actual consumption level is, but that it is a little better than your neighbors. So if you can compare yourself to your direct peers and you're a little bit better off, then that actually can increase your well-being in some cases. So also there we see that, especially in high affluence societies, there can be this treadmill effect that one consumes a little more than the other does. And so there are a lot of social norms around this also. And then last also, there is this, not only the need to be socially accepted, but also the need to feel related. And there have been studies finding that consumption in some societies also builds, shows signals to others that you are successful and can actually increase your chances to finding a partner or starting a family. I mean, these are a bit different topics, but it's just on general how consumption has like positive effects for people. So that was this part. And then we got to something quite similar. Now we're getting to social and societal norms. So often we find in environmental psychology that social norms are actually one of the most, of the strongest factors that influence behavior. And I think that is also what you said when you were talking about societal and cultural change. So the individual alone does not decide so much of their behavior, but they often copy the behavior of others, either intentionally or also because they, like in a subconscious way. So there was a really famous study where there was the effect shown of social media, for example, which shows quite well how social norms work. So I want to just quickly explain that. So there was 2010, when there was the US election, Facebook made a study where they looked at the influence of posts. And they had this post that you see here, today is election day, please go vote. And they compared this as a control condition to show people this, whether they vote more, to this condition where you could also see who of your friends voted. And it was shown in a quite like big study that was published in Nature that it actually makes a big difference. So if you see that your peers are doing something, you're very much more likely to do it. What we see here is two important concepts. The one is just social information. So just what we see others do without having any normative reflection on it, we are more likely to do so as well. So we copy the behavior of others because it has been shown that, or we have made the experience that doing what others do is mostly the right thing. The other one is more like having social acceptance, because we're social animals, we want to be accepted by others. So that is a bit of a different thing, but often leads to the same thing. It's what others expect from us. In psychology, these two things are called descriptive and injunctive social norms. And it has also been shown that especially the social information part, so seeing how others behave, often has the stronger role than the injunctive part. And now in this context, I would like to show how especially social media also promotes flying behavior by posts like this one, which is from a friend of mine. I anonymized it, hopefully enough, showing that people often share on social media, I'm flying there, because they apparently think that that is something that others find cool and interesting. And as we see, it can actually change other people's behavior. And then there's more other, like just a general idea of other narratives that also work against the case of staying grounded. It's two other aspects that are there in society. It's traveling is, for one, it is associated with self-indulgence. And there have been studies that show, although people who normally engage environmentally, when they get into a frame of, now I'm really treating myself, and now I'm on holidays, and now I'm turning off my usual like responsible self, that in that framework of your mind, you actually are less probable to behave according to your values. So you have this narrative for holidays that it's a time of happiness and relaxation and you self-indulge. That is one thing. The other narrative that is also there is that the traveling makes you smarter in a way. So there are a lot of quotes, which I picked two to show you. And one is by Oscar Wilde saying, travel improves the mind wonderfully and does away with all one's prejudice. and nothing develops intelligence like travel by Emile Zola. And it contrasts quite well if you look at how most people travel nowadays is not in a way that would probably enhance their horizon, because most traveling is short-term, is like all-inclusive and so on. But these are narratives that persist and that you find especially also in the wealthy people. So this is also food for thought. Maybe we can discuss later the implications. Okay, so now we have seen all these hurdles, and now comes the scientific part. So we've seen that a lot of motivational, situational, structural, social, and societal barriers exist for staying grounded. So we have all these factors like working against the behavior we would like to see. And now psychology helps us in analyzing these, but it also helps us in providing knowledge on how to change behavior. And what I shown you is like, you can also see it in different models in psychology. I just brought with me one that I find quite intuitive and quick to explain. There are a lot of behavioral models that try to explain why we behave in a certain way. So here you just see one model that includes normative processes. So what we have seen, these were the social norms, but also the personal norms, both which I explained. Then, of course, you have habits. So people tend to behave the way they have always behaved. Although I left this out because traveling behavior is more like a special occasion. So habitual processes in this case would probably be less important. Then you have intentional processes like the attitudes we discussed, and situational influences, which are these constraints and these like prices and so on that play a big role. And what we also can say is that acting sustainably should not be like running a marathon, because then it will be less probable that people show this behavior. So that is why I chose this term of hurdles, because we see a lot of hurdles, and it seems to be in the current situation very hard for people to show this behavior. So I spent a little bit too much time explaining that, so I'm leaving this out. And I want to spend the last, I think, 5 minutes that I have to show you the toolbox from psychology. Sorry, it is a little bit not enough time to explain all of what we do, but there is, for example, a handbook that explains these factors that I explained, but then shows how we can change it. And just 4 little examples. So one example that is very like with an individual focus is that you can make people be more able to change their behavior by action planning. Then there are really famous experiments showing that if you tell people, save the environment, don't throw away your towel in a hotel, they won't do it. But if you tell them that 80% of all the other guests do it, then they do it. So the strength of social norms. Then you have defaults and nudging, which I won't get into because I think it's at the moment very much discussed. And as a last example, there's at the moment Flugstreik, maybe some of you know it. It's one example of a public commitment where you can raise collective self-efficacy. So the collective, like doing something collectively can make you feel more like what you're doing makes sense and you're not the only one doing it. So there is other theories as well that go more into, well, this is all an individual focus, as you might notice. So there are other theories looking at reflecting your needs. So what has been found is that socialization and treadmills effects have a big, are often there in our society. So that our consumption is not really oriented on what we really need, but what we have learned to want. So in one theory that persists is that is said that psychological resources exist that help both behaving sustainably and like helping yourself. And there are some traits that you can foster in people, so they will at the same time be happier, but also behave more sustainably. I just want to like get this in, but I don't have the time to explain it, but you will find it in the literature. And it's about fostering personal abilities like feeling self-efficient, feeling like having a sense of self-acceptance, of enjoyment capacity, and also concepts like mindfulness and finding a meaning in what you do and feeling solidarity, like showing solidarity in what you do, has all been shown to at the same time increase well-being, but also increase sustainable behavior. So these are also things we could follow. And then often in psychology, there are methods that try to reframe behavior. So people actually reflect on what actually makes them happy and what is needed for a good life for all. So how much consumption do we need to be happy? So the difficulty here is to find an intervention where people actually get to this level of reflection, but once you do, it can be really helpful. And and to see all this reflection of values and like having a mind shift in a way, this can also then ideally be in a more societal level where we create new societal norms and stories and new narratives, asking what is normal, for example, by showing that flying is still a privilege, or asking what is luxury and self-indulgence. Maybe it's not flying somewhere fast, but maybe it's slow travel, time, wealth, and so on. And asking also what is modern and hip, because there are concepts that show that the cool thing to do is actually the sustainable thing to do, like minimalism or voluntary simplicity, or also asking what is an adventure. So that traveling is not actually about getting somewhere fast, but about the traveling and the experience itself. And then last slide, sorry for being not on time, because I often hear the criticism and also hear that environmental psychology is only about the individual, but that shouldn't be confused with it's only about the consumer. Because when you take an individual approach, you try to change an individual's behavior, but it doesn't have to be their consumption behavior. So we can also reflect on using these tools that I showed for people when you address them as citizens, as family members, as parts of organizations, or in education, also in politics, so in an administrative role, or as an activist, or as a peer or role model when it comes to social norms. And then you can use the same, like all these tools that I quickly tried to explain, they also work for individuals when you don't look at consumption, but maybe on how to get active, to be an activist, to vote the right thing, and to make a change in society, and not just not flying. Oops, sorry. And so just to sum up, I want to make clear that first and foremost, there have to be structural, political, and economic changes, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and which also is shown by psychological research. But the tools to change behavior that psychologists find are, of course, when it comes to individual change, they are the strongest. So we try to increase personal norms and feelings of moral responsibility, and we try to decrease the hedonistic motivation to fly. So to reframe the needs that people feel. And then we also try to empower them to act. So to make self-efficacy higher and make it easier for people to behave sustainably. And then these tools can ideally be used to have a societal mind shift and to disseminate new stories around the good life and about good travel. Yeah, so that was my input, trying to get everything into 20 minutes. And I would be happy to answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for your great input. So I give it over to you now, the participants. Do you have any concrete questions of understanding or whatever to Vivian? Please raise your hand if you have one.
We already had one question also being raised in the chat by Kat, saying that perhaps habits for travel are getting more important because people are in the habit of getting abroad each year, using websites like Skyscanner instead of Man in the Seat 61, which is a website for traveling by train.
I would also agree that habits are in fact important. It's just that most psychological research that is done on habits is more about switching. So it is more on habits that are done in a daily level. But of course, you can also see this as a habit if people have a habit of flying every year several times. Yes. So that is maybe, sadly, that's a new development.
Yeah, thank you. Also, Lars mentioned that he will be talking more about habits later on. And I see that Julian has also raised his hand. Julian?
So I was just wondering, when you say that for people's perceived well-being, it's important that they're a little bit better off than their peers. Is that something that's very well generalizable? Has that been studied in many types of societies, many types of groups, or is that just something that applies to certain types of groups but not others? And my second question is, do you know of any research that looks at kind of social stratification and how sort of the values that people associate with travel differ by class or by social strata, anything like that?
Yeah. So I hope that Lars, that maybe.
Sorry, Vivian, can you speak up a bit? You were a lot louder before, and now.
Yeah,
we found out that when I don't speak for a while, my microphone gets really bad. It should turn on, hopefully, after I talk for like 3 seconds. Yeah. Okay. Now I forgot the question. Yeah, which group? Yeah. So there is a whole bunch of literature around well-being and consumption, and most literature shows that after a certain level of consumption, well-being doesn't increase. And I guess you've all heard this in some way or another. But this other effect is more in the research area of treadmill effects, which shows that new consumption makes you happy for a short while, but in the long run, you get adapted to your new level of consumption and your well-being doesn't increase. And in the course of studying this, I have just found, actually it is from one study that showed that the comparison with your neighbor or your direct peers actually shows an increase of well-being. But I just know this study, so haven't done a literature research on it. And about social groups, I have not seen research, but that would be maybe an interesting question also for Lars, because he's more in sociology. Yeah.
Okay, are there any more questions for Vivian? If not, then we can continue with the input from Lars. Please, Lars, share your screen.
Just in a minute. Right, here we go, I think. And here we are. No. Right. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this webinar. This is a topic that I find really interesting. And I would also like to thank Vivian for her great presentation. I would like to say a bit about the social dynamics through which behavior is shaped, and thereby also the social dynamics through which behavior might change. I would, though, first of all like to share some examples. They are from a study I conducted a couple of years ago, where I encountered people who had made sort of pro-environmental changes in their households and in their daily practices. I will perhaps not mention all the examples on the screen, but firstly, I would like to share the change that a guy had undergone reducing his meat consumption. Well, the question was, why did he do that? And he mentioned a lot of different sources. One source was simply the flow of media stories about climate change, about the impact of meat consumption in climate change, about environmental deterioration, and also animal welfare. But that was boosted by the film made by Leonardo DiCaprio. I forget the name of the film, and also a lot of the stuff that is has been produced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So there was this celebrity endorsement that really triggered something in him. And finally, he had a flatmate and a karate friend that were moving down that same path. And the interesting thing was for him that it sort of changed his values. The whole climate concern sort of was moving and gaining a bigger and bigger place in his consciousness and in his value system, so to speak. But also what was at stake for him was developing abilities to cook without meat. So that was what he shared with his flatmate, for instance. Then I would also like to mention that the flush of photovoltaic installations on Danish single-family houses a while ago, and there were in a period some very favorable resale rates, and also some tax deduction stuff for installing the solar panels. And they were in effect for a while, and then that was too costly for the state. So politicians decided to minimize those very favorable rates, resale rates. And that was, of course, communicated through media. And that sort of created an extra rush of solar panel installations. And the interesting thing here is sort of the combination of government policies, of a kind of media campaigning. Most of the campaigning was just in the shape of news stories about this policy change. And then how that actually manifested itself in something as drastic as putting photovoltaic or solar panels on the roof. And that's quite costly. But there was this rush. So you see a lot of, what I'm trying to say here is that you see a lot of elements at stake. You do actually see a kind of media campaigning in the two examples I mentioned. DiCaprio making a film, government regulation that is communicated through media, but also you see how values are changing, how a building is changed, how your abilities to cook are changed. So a lot of things are going on here. Finally, I would like to mention a third example, which was that a while ago, water consumption was actually reduced significantly in Denmark. And that was a result of two things. You had new infrastructure and new equipment, so you'd have low flush in your toilets. You'd have some stuff that reduces the amount of water that flows through the tap. But you'd also have a lot of really official campaigns saying, turn off the water while you're toothbrushing. So that was a combination of the two that I think was manifested itself in quite a serious reduction in water consumption. So those were a couple of examples, and then I would like then to go to some of the more general aspects in what I try to say something about the social dynamics that change practices. There have been some rather naive conceptions, maybe dating back even to the 50s, about how people might change and how actions might change. And that rather naive understanding would go something like that. You communicate the science, then people understand the science, and they think, oh, I need to change my behavior. So they change their attitude, and then they change their behavior. It's called the ABC model. It could have been called something better, but that's it's nice with those good names for models. But that's kind of the naive conception. Just say something out there, people will understand it, and then they will change their attitudes and change their behavior. Another approach that is sort of inadequate is a theoretical approach that has been widely spread in social sciences some decades ago and mainly survives in economy these days. And it's called the rational choice approach, or economic man, and man is understood as human beings. And according to this approach, individuals just choose specific behaviors to optimize their own benefit and reduce cost. And that approach has been criticized widely. First of all, a lot of what we are doing as human beings are not really choices. It's just something we do. It's habits and it's routines. You do your dishes, you do your laundry in the same way, using the same amount of water and washing liquid as you always have. That is just how it's done. And you don't really reflect so much about it. So we need to understand that behavior or practice is a matter of routine, very much. And it's even a matter of routine when you take an airplane. When I was doing a lot of traveling as a young person, I knew how to take the train, whereas taking a plane was more alien to me. Now it's reversed. Moreover, the problem with rational choice approach is that people don't act just to optimize own benefit. As Vivian mentioned, there's a lot of ethics involved in people's actions. We also need to understand that own benefit is not just economic, it's also health. And moreover, we need to understand that the infrastructures in which we live, the houses in which we live, they make some actions possible and other actions impossible. So if you want to take the car, but you do not want to take the car, but the nearest shopping place is a shopping mall 15 kilometers away, then it's quite difficult to choose away the car, to choose some other ways of transporting yourself to shopping options. So all this is important when we're trying to understand what people do, why people do that, and how it can be changed. So then a lot of sociologists who are doing environmental social science have started subscribing to what is called practice theory. And again, practice theory does not want to focus on individual choice in order to understand what people do, to understand people's actions or practices, social practices, nor do practice theorists just want to focus on structures as something that dictate people's actions. Their focus of attention, those who apply a practice theory, is just the actions themselves. What do people actually do? What do people say? The social practices, the social doings. And one cornerstone in practice theory is then to identify some key factors that shape these social practices. And these key factors are meanings, it's competences, and I'll go through them in the next slides. It's meaning, it's competences, it's materials, and it's regulations. And I think maybe meanings needs most explanation, because meanings are a lot of things, or orientations. I mean, actions are oriented towards some things. They contain meanings. And what does that mean? Well, when you travel, you are oriented towards the good life, actually. Well, of course, not if you're a business traveler, but right now I'm mainly talking about leisure traveling. So built into the practice of traveling is conceptions of the good life, to enjoy sun, to experience new cultures and so on. But there are also another aspects of meanings, and that's the ethics or behavioral norms. And it is an ethic to have cultural openness. It's a norm that thrives out there and has been very much integrated in how we understand traveling and how we enact traveling. That traveling is actually good because it increases cultural openness, it's believed. We meet other cultures, we meet other people, we can have social relations across borders. All that is perceived to be really valuable. And let me just include another quote, which is from Hans Christian Andersen, who said, to travel is to live. But then I would also like to mention a third aspect of this orientation, and that's something that's deeply ingrained in human behavior, and that's doing what everybody else is doing, mimesis, that what is done. And that shows itself in these weird bucket lists. Before you die, you have to do this and you have to do that. I remember in earlier times, going to Mallorca was just something you had to do. This is what is done. Then with traveling, there's a really weird opposite to mimesis, and that is doing what is not yet done, where after everybody is doing that also. And it's a really powerful aspect of human action, just miming doing what's done. I would like then to just lend a few words to how this applies to campaigning. And I would say that changing these meanings are an integral part of practice change. And that is also an integral part of campaigning, that you are appealing to different meanings. That maybe, of course, the climate impact, but you can also have slow travel, as Vivian mentioned, as a value that you pursue. And all these kinds of meanings are disseminated through, for instance, travel journalism, blogging, and YouTubing, etc. Then we've already mentioned also another aspect of people's actions, which is the material equipment and infrastructures. I would like to dwell on just one of these, and that's IT, or information and communication technology software. And it's become really annoyingly difficult to take the train across borders. Even 10 years ago it was easier, but the support for ticket purchase has deteriorated, whereas travel planning for flights is really easy. And there are any number of applications that can be used for that purpose. And I think we should use this kind of immaterial software in that category of materialities or of infrastructures that can either enable or disable very specific practices. But other than that, of course, if the station is closed, then you can't take the train. Sorry about that. And then there are also, of course, some various properties of the various machinery, speed, the accessibility, but also the comfort. And maybe it's actually more comfortable to take the train and the plane, whereas, of course, speed and accessibility is different. Another aspect is competences, just knowing how and what to do. Let me just, if I may, dwell on an example from not from flying, but from other types of transport. I was sitting at a cafe close to a park. There's a train going out to that park. I was listening to three ladies sitting at the next table, and they were bitching about the heavy traffic. And I was just wondering, why the hell didn't they take the train? It was very easy. They could drink as much as they wanted instead of just sipping one glass of wine. It was just out. It was something they, this is my interpretation, of course. I think it's just never occurred to them that was an option, because they just don't know how to use the train. And this is also important, I think, with flying, that you might not know how to take a train across borders. So competences, and this is also another important point, is something that gets incorporated or embodied to an extent where you really don't think about them, you just do them. But when you have to learn new ways of doing stuff, then this is a barrier, that's a hindrance for applying new practices. And I think that a core element in campaigning here will actually be to teach new competences and also maybe to address application developers who can assist people in this. Finally, I'm not sure how much time I have left, but regulation is of course also important. It's obvious with the taxes and the fees. We all know about the ridiculous lack of taxing on airplane fuels. You can have standards for NOx emission and so on. But I would also like to mention rules at a different level, namely workplace rules, where at EU hitherto we have been blocked from choosing trains because they are often not the cheapest option. And also we spend a lot of work hours on taking the train. But those rules can be changed. Actually, EU has recently been talking about changing that kind of rules if you are a government employee. And other workplaces can do the same. So that was the different kinds of factors that shape practices, social practices, and may also be very important when you try to change those social practices. Finally, I promised to mention something about a campaign that applied practice theoretical thinking. I'm not sure that those who have devised this campaign actually had thought about practice theory, but in practice, that was how it worked. And across Europe and also in Denmark, we have had a serious increase in source separation, household separation of waste. And that has come about through various, changing various aspects of people's waste handling. So you have developed new equipment that enables source separation. You have people, municipalities have made campaigns informing citizens what to do. These campaigns have addressed the competences, how to handle dirty tins and glasses, for instance. They have also addressed the norms, and as it turns out, separating waste is a widespread norm that was already out there, but the options weren't available. So the campaigns, at least in Denmark, to develop household separation of waste has sort of addressed all these aspects of practices and of practice changes quite successfully, actually. So that was pretty much what I wanted to share with you. And I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're right on time. So
I lost track of time.
Yeah. So now the question to you, dear participants, again. Do you have any questions for Lars regarding his presentation? Please raise your hand. If there are no specific questions, I would also like to know if some of you have maybe heard of any campaigns that address these different elements that Lars was talking about, of flying, for flying perhaps. If you know of some, please.
Anna has raised her hand. Anna?
Yes, I still have a question.
Okay.
So when you introduced what praxis theory looks at, you said that it doesn't look at the individual behavior itself, and it doesn't focus as well on the structures underlying it, but at the praxis itself. But then actually when you explained the different steps, that's a lot of the structures laying behind that. So can you maybe explain again what you mean with this focus on the praxis itself, and what is the differentiation between looking at the underlying structures? I think I didn't exactly get that.
Yeah, it might turn out to be a rather long sociological discussion. Practice theoretical scholars claim that they have solved the structure-actor dilemma. They haven't. Nobody have. Nobody will. So the thing is maybe that it's a slightly different understanding of where the social is located. Some theories in social sciences locate the social in the individual, and then they see the social as an aggregate of all the individuals. Other social theories locate the social in, for instance, discourses, and then practice theory will say, well, the social is doings. That's where the social is happening. But then when trying to explain that, we resort either to what happens when you learn things. That's very individual. Actually, at the end of the day, everybody acquire competences in their own way. That will any practice theorist say. But at the other hand, physical structures, infrastructures, tools, they are already there. You live in a world as an individual where they are already there. So whenever you try to explain what's going on, you either end in the individual or in the structural, and it's like that really. So I'm pretty sure it's an unsatisfactory answer, but I'm also pretty sure I can't give a better one.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Or maybe examples of campaigns you know that have addressed various elements of the practice of flying? We would be very interested in that too. Okay. If not, then we can continue with the input. I will give now a short input about the Let's Stay Grounded campaign and how we try to combine these different approaches. I will just share my screen, one moment. So I hope you can see it now. Yeah. So thank you very much again, Lars and Vivian, for giving these great inputs. I think they're a good basis also for our discussion afterwards. Yeah, the Let's Stay Grounded campaign team, that's 5 people right now. We principally share the critique that also practice theory is voicing regarding purely individualistic approaches. That means we actually do not think that by persuading as many people as possible to change their behavior, that alone will be enough to make a social transformation take place automatically. This is because people are part of diverse social contexts. They make it less or more easy for them not to fly. And these contexts are the problem, really. So they are part of the political, material, and economic structures we all live in. And those, or practices, if you want to phrase it in practice theory, and those lock in certain practices of being mobile. For example, rail travel is still much too expensive. There are, for example, professional practices or life situations that urge some people to fly. For example, if there are families living abroad. Or they may not have access to good alternative transport infrastructure. That's something maybe we have all experienced at some time or another. However, many people living in Europe do have some degrees of freedom to choose not to fly. And those are the ones we want to address in this campaign. Even if many people are persuaded to change their behavior voluntarily, that means maybe they pledge not to fly, we still think they will definitely be outweighed by the millions of people predicted to start flying in the near future. We all know the numbers, the prognosis. They are really, yeah, very sad. And also we know that over 1,000 airports are being built right now, expanded right now, and those people will be served by these airports. But we still think that campaigns focusing on individuals, like pledge campaigns, where people pledge not to fly anymore, they are very valuable because, as Lars has already said, meanings and norms are an important part of the practice of flying or practices of being mobile. So those people that are able and willing to change their behavior, they can play an important role in system change. I will talk about this more a bit later. And the aim of the campaign is actually to politicize the growing movement of people and also institutions that are stopping or reducing flying. And we want to do that by encouraging them to also fight for changes in policies and against concrete airport expansion projects. So even though the campaign is partially inspired by practice theory, we still also value the contribution of psychological theories because, like I said before, meanings are an important part of the practice of flying. And also people who are pledging are doing this out of different motives, and psychology can really help us to encourage them to pledge and encourage them to also get politically active. So I think psychology can also help us there. Then to the next slide. Even in the campaign, we want to address different elements of the practice of flying. You have already seen that in Lars's presentation. We have here meanings and norms, competences, rules or regulations, and the materiality and infrastructure. Lars has talked about this quite a lot now. I think you all know what I mean by that. And in our campaign, we want to challenge these different elements of the practice of flying simultaneously. And that's maybe something that's new. At least I don't know of another campaign having done it before in the area of flying. Because most of campaigns focus only on one of these parts, like only on the norms or only on the rules, or there are maybe actions regarding materiality and like the airports, for example. But the aim of this campaign is to really bring these things more together. And we want to do that by promoting existing initiatives on our platform and connecting them with each other. For example, initiatives that collect pledges of individuals, initiatives that collect pledges of institutions that changed, for example, their work travel policies so that people are not forced to fly anymore for work. And we would also want to foster people getting active within their organizations to change their own travel policies there. Then we have direct actions against airport expansion projects. Many Stay Grounded members are active in this part of the campaign. And campaigns for specific political measures like the kerosene tax that's out just now. So that would be also a very very important part of changing the practice of flying. Or another petition could be like for more night trains or better rail connections and so on. So we want to connect all these different parts of the campaign with each other. And all these different parts of the campaign, they address also different parts of the practice of flying, like pledges of individuals and institutions are more on the meanings, norms side, but also regarding the competences. For example, regarding the competences, we will try to organize collectively and share knowledge about grounded traveling via our campaign platform. So how to get from A to B by train, for example, to have information on that for people who are trying not to fly anymore. And regarding meanings and norms, they are also, of course, influenced by actions and petitions, but mainly also by these pledges of individuals. And as I said before, we want also to engage them in the other pillars of the campaign you see right here. And also to create a new narratives of staying grounded. The material dimension is also very important. This would be, for example, airport infrastructure, where actions can take place that gradually change the discourse and also try to really focus on also the big corporations behind the aviation industry, so to make them more visible and more accountable, really. But the other thing would also be, like Lars said, online conferencing tools and organizations that are something that are a material part of not having to fly anymore. Yeah. So. And to sum up, the role of individuals we see in this campaign is like I will try to explain now, like Vivian has also mentioned before, we don't see them solely as consumers, but foremost as political citizens demanding systemic change. And that's why I think that also pledge campaigns can really contribute to systemic change. Individuals that pledge can also anticipate the change that has to happen, because they sort of, when they decide not to fly anymore, they experience in their own lives the systemic obstacles that are here, that are present when you try not to fly anymore. For example, rail travel that's not really happening in a good way, or other things. Yeah, that's what I just said. And if organized collectively, they can become ambassadors for systemic change out of a personal interest for one part, because they, they want not to be punished constantly by society for choosing not to fly. They want to have good connections. They, they want to have, don't want to pay as much for train travel like they have to pay now. But also because they want to have a real impact on a global level. And this only happens if there are structural changes taking place. This only happens if, for example, flying gets much more expensive, and if airports are stopped being built. So they have an interest in becoming active in these parts of the campaign. We hope, at least, so we will try to encourage them to become active. A very important part of our campaign, of course, is like working with civil society. We think it's important to work with civil society, like many of your campaigns are too, to bring about systemic change, since political and economic systems are currently victims of their own logics. But of course, and that's something you can always criticize about campaigns in general, the influence is only indirect. So we can try to do these campaigns and build up pressure via media work and build pressure on politicians, but there won't be a very direct effect of the work we do here. Principally, we think that systemic and behavioral changes are two sides of one coin. They are connected intrinsically with each other, and the aviation system will only change if many of these different elements that we were talking about now are destabilized at the same time, and then, so that a new system can emerge that enables sustainable transportation for all of us. Yeah, that was my short input. So if you have specific questions regarding my input, you can ask them now. If there are no questions, then I will,
sorry, we have one question in the chat from Kat, who doesn't have a mic. So do we know what the split between business and personal travel is?
I have different numbers in my mind, but I think they are for different countries. I don't know, Mira, do you know?
I see Kate, who has raised her hand. Is that a direct response?
No, I was going to ask Michaela a question.
Okay. Well, I don't have a global number or anything that I can now get out of my mind right now. I'm happy to look at it and include it into the material we send out after the webinar. Or is any of the other participants able to answer Kat's question? Lucy in the chat answered that about 1/3 of the travel is business travel. Lucy, would that be on a European level or?
Yeah,
Lucy?
I think so. I need to check that, but I know it's around 1/3 from memory, and I'll look up our sources. But I think like the most comprehensive data set comes from the UK, from the Civil Aviation Authority, which collects like really refined data about who flies and why, and income brackets, etc. And I think, yeah, the majority of aviation is actually either leisure or it's visiting family and friends. But it's quite hard to tell really, because many people combine business and visiting family and friends and leisure. So
Yeah.
it depends how you slice up but it's less than people think. People assume that business travel is the bigger portion, but it's not.
Yeah, we have another answer from Eric, who says that tourism is about 50% worldwide, and he is happy to share a slide with figures. Eric, do you want to jump in?
Yes, but I don't know how to share it. What should I do?
Down below you have share your screen below the video.
Yeah, okay.
And then you click on start screen sharing.
Okay.
And you choose the program where your presentation.
Okay. Do you see it?
Nope. Right.
No.
Yeah, now we can see it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's in French, but you have figures for France and for Le Monde, that means worldwide. So you can see that leisure and tourism is about 50% either in France or in the world. And work is, there is more travels for work in France, 28%, than worldwide, which is only 14%. And the rest is mostly family travel.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for being so well prepared. And there was a direct reaction to that in the chat too, from Kat. If we are thinking of tackling business travel in the same concept spoken about today, or is it a different approach? Michaela, maybe you want to add something on the institutional pledges?
I'm sorry, I was just a bit distracted. The question it's written in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that there have to be different approaches, because work travel is very much part of work practices, and people don't have that much freedom to really choose otherwise, if there are like restrictions regarding institutional policies on taking the cheapest option and so on. So actually, I think people traveling for leisure have more degrees of freedom to choose other modes of travel. And that's why I think it's so important also in the framework of the campaign to really give institutions that are willing to do so some kind of guidance on how to change their travel policies inside their institution. So yeah, I think that's, from my perspective, one answer you can have here.
Wonderful. So Kate has raised her hand for quite a long time. Kate?
Hi, thanks so much for the really great presentations. I had two questions actually, one directly to Michaela. Great that you're focusing on this systemic and behavior changes, two sides of the same coin. So I was wondering if you get pushback on that approach, because there's such a lot of discourse around at the moment about how individual change is useless and we need systemic change, and that's supposed to magically happen. And I think you've given a really good explanation of how to make that happen. I was just wondering what the reaction is. And to all of the presenters, I was just going to ask about the policy approach. So often when we talk about aviation, we talk about the need for different pricing to reflect the externalities. And of course, the pricing is ridiculous. I'm sure we all agree about that. But given that what we all also know, that income is one of the most important predictors of footprint, and that research shows that people will support a tax on flying, they also intend to pay the tax and continue to fly. Should there be so much focus on the pricing of flights, perhaps there could also be, although it's controversial, starting to talk about carbon rationing and just limiting the ability to fly altogether, rather than kind of maintaining the inequality by saying we'll just make it more expensive. Obviously that's a part of it, but I just wondered what you all think about that.
Yeah, I think I will start. Yeah, actually, we did have quite a big discussion about this discrepancy of individual and systemic change also at our conference in Barcelona. I think it's something that you have to like that's really part of our job, really, to have this discussion. I think only when you have a very naive perception of what individuals can do, then it's really a problem. But this doesn't mean that they don't have a role at all. So that's what I was trying to explain, especially when they organize in a collective. I think that can be really a force behind asking for systemic change too. But this collective organizing has to happen, of course. If it's just the campaigns only focus on like individuals telling them what to do, like having holidays and so on, and it stops there, I think we won't. It won't change much. So that's my opinion. The important thing would be to really mobilize people who are already willing to change their behavior, to really push for policy changes too, as I explained before. So I think, yeah, you can have this discussion without discarding the individual altogether, but really regarding it as a political citizen, really. And that's also quite empowering too, I think. So that if you organize collectively, we can change something.
Okay, Lars and Vivian, do you want to add something, since you were also mentioned in the questions? I think Lars said he has something to say too in chat.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Should I start? I'll start. Kate, I think you mentioned pricing, well, the problem is that we do know from a lot of environmental regulation that pricing or taxing and putting fees and stuff might help, but it has to be significant, and I doubt that significant taxing on airplane travel is politically feasible within in the near future. So that would be one comment on that. Then I would like, I mean, this discussion whether it should be individual or collective changes is ongoing, and the thing is that if we're talking about collective behavior when it's changing, then it's very much experienced as individual, as an individual choice even. It's exactly when you're breaking out of routines that that reflections start to engender, and it's very much felt like something that an individual is doing. But as a matter of fact, as Vivian and myself have talked about, the normative aspect of these changes is very important, and these normative changes are processes that are obviously social at the end of the day, but also equally obviously happen within individuals. And furthermore, normative changes are enacted. It's something that people start doing or stop doing. So I really don't see that addressing individuals is solely a naive and useless endeavor. Quite the contrary, addressing these issues at an individual level will at the same time be an aspect of the normative cultural changes. That's a long answer, I know, but I hope I made sense in some way.
Thank you, Lars. Vivian, you wanted to say something too?
Yeah, so I think the campaign that you are planning reflects that quite well, that we need an inclusive approach. So when we first started discussing this webinar, I was worrying that you would like put the individual approach against the structural approach. And I think that is the wrong idea, because we have an additive system. So both the individual motivations, which are of course influenced by many, many factors, and also the actual situation we are in, both need to be changed. If you only have one changing, then I don't think any big change could happen. So, and also what I perceived was that Lars and I often said the same thing in different words. So there is actually not such a big bridge to cross. So I think we all have an idea about that it is a complex problem. And yeah, I find it really encouraging that you also take this approach where you try to like have different levels of action. That's, I think, quite important. And what I also want to point out is that not to confuse like the inner decision process, which happens individually for everyone who gets active. It is not the same as approaching people individually. So you can have an approach that is more structural, but it will still affect the individual. So if you change prices, it will affect individual decisions, and also the other way around. So it's more like a dynamic than a one-way. So we have the dynamic between the group and the individual that is always happening. So that's why we need to tackle both, I think. Yeah. I don't know. I hope I made that clear. Yeah, but thank you. It was really interesting.
Thanks a lot, Vivian. I see I have now Elizabeth on my list, and also Anne and Magdalena, who have raised their hand. I'm wondering, Anne and Magdalena, is this direct reactions? Do you want to discuss this point further, or otherwise I would take Elizabeth's question first?
Yeah, I'd like to give another answer or like comment to Kate's questions.
Perfect.
So yeah, first of all, thanks a lot, Vivian. I think it was one thing that I wanted to point out, that for me, like including individual behavior change into a theory of systemic change, we have to take really care that we don't blame individuals too much what they're doing, because we have to take into account why they're doing this. And of course, in the end, as you also said, Michaela, if we want to have system change, that's in a way a collective change of people's behavior or practices. But the question is of how to address them. And if we want to address them in blaming them and telling them, yeah, whatever the structure is, just change your behavior, which will not work because it's mostly not possible or often not possible, and neglecting also like financial, social, whatever differences? Or do we aim to like support the possibility of individuals to change maybe their behaviors, that change the surrounding that supports their behaviors? So this is one important thing for me concerning that. And the other thing is about the pricing. I thanks a lot, Kate, for raising this, because I think it's really important, and it addresses the fact that with aviation we have a topic that is really, or like a subject that has a lot of inequality in its subject, as Vivian mentioned as well, and that there are very few people that fly very often. And if we just raise prices, or if we just raise taxes, it will probably the people that fly just a few times that will be affected first, and not the very frequent flyers, because they're very wealthy. So I think it's a really important thing to think also about rules and regulations here that limit flights, that limit especially short hauls or short haul flights, but also think about how can we actually limit the number of flights overall taken by limiting airport expansions, by limiting the number of flights that can take off from an airport. And it's of course an interesting discussion to think about how to maybe distribute the number of flights that can be taken between the individuals. But here I see, even though it would be probably a more just approach, I have really, it's really difficult to imagine how would that work, even though it seems quite fair. But it's a really, for me, it's a really difficult thing to imagine, even though I would like to maybe. But also maybe Lena can say more about it. I wanted to mention that we're just working on the report of our Degrowth of Aviation conference, where we are trying exactly to get together all the different measures that could be used for reducing aviation, and asking the question whether price instruments are actually the right thing to do, or whether it needs also other instruments and what they could be.
Thanks, Annalena. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, it's basically also what I wanted to say, just to point out that we are writing this report right now, and basically taxing aviation is mostly only for eliminating the unfair privileges of the aviation industry and to end the tax exemptions. But it will for sure not inhibit those who fly often from flying, because it's mostly people with lots of money who fly most. So so that's why we are discussing in this report also measures like limits on short-haul flights and a frequent flyer levy and the air miles levy, some very interesting approaches, I think. That's all. And we will have actually the next webinar on this topic, which will be on the 5th of December, where we will present the outcomes of the report.
Thanks very much, Lena. Then we have the question from Elizabeth Thompson, who is asking if there are any resources or studies looking into travel or behavior change strategies for business travel. If some of you might not have read the comment sections, the chat section, so in case any of you have literature to share, feel free either to say so now or to add your sources into the chat box.
Yeah, I would also be very happy about sources, because I already researched this kind of studies. There are not that many, really. And we are really looking forward also for institutional pledges to have some studies in the background in order for us to know how to design the institutional pledge, and also the how-to guides, how to change institutional travel policies. I know some articles I can share with you afterwards, Elizabeth, if you're interested, but yeah, if other ones of you have some, I'm happy to know them, get to know them. Thank you.
Wonderful, yeah. So in case any other participants have knowledge of literature, please just share it in the chat. And are there any other direct questions concerning the presentations or the discussion, comments for the discussion? Yes, Christian.
Sorry, Christian.
Sorry, now you're unmuted. We should hear you now, I think.
Sorry, I did. Sorry, Mira.
No, it's okay. Sorry. Right?
Yeah.
You can hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
I don't recall that any speaker today has spoken about the time frame in which these developments are going to happen. If I consider the very pressing situation with implementing changes, are there any ideas among the speakers that they could kindly share on what time frames would be realistic for the measures that they think are worthwhile considering?
Okay, thank you, Christian.
I can't answer fully, but I do have a comment to that question, if that's okay. The problem is that social change is slow. We know that, but sometimes we see slightly more rapid changes. We have seen that with meat consumption. The thing is, there has been a rapidity. It's happened quickly that some reduction has started, but the really serious reduction that we need, that will take 10, 15 years. We saw it also, we've seen it with the organic food that has developed mainly in Austria, Switzerland, Germany, UK, so on, over maybe a couple of decades. And so that's the kind, I mean, these, even though there is a positive thinking about consumers and the citizens about these things, change just come about slowly. Unless, of course, flying is heavily taxed. That's a different case. But my guess is that you can see a little change happen quite quickly, and then it'll take some time for the big change.
Okay.
And obviously,
other reactions to Christian's question?
Yeah, no, I just want to emphasize what Lars said. I think he's totally right about the problem we are facing right now in general is that we have to have a really radical change in a very short time. And historically, social change has happened over a long time in our societies. So that's actually one of the biggest problems we are facing right now. How can we get to the systemic change in just, I don't know, 20 years or so. So that's what we will have to work on. And I also think that, things can also develop very fast in a short time. I think there are many things changing right now, and it's really important that our campaigns stress the climate impacts of aviation right now. I think now is a time where things can have a bigger impact than they had maybe 5 years before. So things are also changing, but I think no one can have a good prognosis on what a timeline could look like, because it's too chaotic to predict. I'm always very skeptical of scenarios and so on. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Lars and Michaela. Are there other comments concerning the discussion?
I mean, I also have some questions I have prepared. I can share them if you want.
Yeah, and also Lars still wants to share an example of another.
Oh yes, Lars, go ahead, and then maybe we can. Yeah. So, yeah.
Sorry, Lars, I'm just unmuting you because your audio is not on.
I will unmute myself.
Perfect.
Right. It's just a piece of news I heard from Denmark very recently this week that the Association of High School Students in Denmark has entered into a collaboration with Danish State Railways and a couple of other institutional actors to develop new high school trips where you do not take the plane, but the train to somewhere, making the travel, the actual moving as part of the experience. And I think that's very interesting that high school students move on this. And that may be also an issue of further campaigning.
Thanks a lot, Lars. Vivian also raised her hand.
Yeah, concerning this, I also thought it could make sense to find partners in these endeavors. And at the TU Berlin, actually, where I work, and other unis in Berlin as well, there is a self-pledge from the scientists working there to not take flights. I don't know if you've heard that, but I could give you information about it as well.
Okay. I think I will just, we have like 5 or at least 10 minutes of discussion time left. We can use it if we want to, we don't have to. Just one suggestion would be some questions I have thought about sharing with you. And since I know that many of you are working in campaigns right now, I would just be interested in maybe you can think of some answers to these questions. So what are your experiences with different approaches in your campaigns, and what is your opinion on them? Which assumptions regarding system change guide the campaigns you are active in? And what could be an ideal campaign against aviation that you could think of that aims for systemic change? So which are central elements that need to be addressed? If someone has some kind of intuitive answer to that, would be great. Okay, if not, then
I mean, sorry, I have Julian who has raised his hand and Vivian.
Yeah, okay.
So Julian, maybe you want to go first?
So I don't have an ideal campaign that you could run, sorry, but I do have some ideas.
Julian, please speak up.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I have so I'm active with Back on Track, and we campaign for the European cross-border rail network and for night trains. And I think so an important aspect of campaigning against aviation is that, in my view, alternatives do need to exist and do need to be promoted, but not directly in the sense that we tell people to take these alternatives or through consumer choice the transformation will happen. I think they're primarily important to make to create more political space to directly take measures against the aviation industry. Because if there's no alternatives available to people, it's very easy for the aviation industry to say, you know, people need these services, you're just attacking consumers and so forth. So I would say the promotion of alternatives is primarily important for political reasons and to create political space, at least in my view.
Thanks, Julian. Vivian?
I mean, there are lots of little examples, but just 2 things, because I'm also active in Switzerland. In Switzerland, there's Umverkehr, which is a small NGO doing a lot of nice campaigns, which you might want to check out if you don't already know them. Which was the other one? Okay, so Umverkehr. Yeah, and no, I'll think about it again. I'll send it later. Yeah, the SBB, the train, now I get it, the train company in Switzerland, they have a really nice new advertisement where instead of prices, they put the CO2 emissions of their travels. So that's also something cool, where an organization is doing something. Yeah.
Thank you, Vivian. Are there any other reactions to the questions? Quite broad questions, maybe not so easy to answer them right away. I see that Christian has raised his hand. Christian, please unmute yourself before you start.
I wonder, well, for my pedigree, I'm a mathematician, but I'm not a game theorist, but I'm sure that these aspects, there is some relation of some of these aspects to sociology and psychology, fields that I'm obviously not very familiar with at all. I would like to ask, to which extent do you anticipate the reaction of the aviation industry to whatever you are doing? We agree that what is to be done is a multi-layered approach, extend the time that is going to be needed in order to change the consumers' thinking about flights and different to convince them that it's better not to fly when they can avoid it. And I have only been involved in the airport expansion protest since September last year, so my timeline is fairly short, but I believe in that short time, obviously a lot has happened, and the aviation industry is not sleeping. They are thinking themselves about how to improve their sort of standing, and they are coming up with, they're obviously very well resourced, unlike, I think, a lot of the people who are standing, or organizations who are standing up against them. I want to ask, what are your thoughts on how to see this? Well, maybe game is a bit of an exaggeration, but how do you anticipate the actions that the aviation industry will take? It will obviously take actions in order to improve the image of flying.
I can have a short answer to that. Yeah, I think this is very much also about influencing the narratives that are dominant in the media discourse. And of course, you're totally right that the aviation industry tries to talk about CO2 neutral growth and about sustainable aviation. And that's something that Stay Grounded is, I think, generally really criticizing a lot and trying to inform people about this. And I think it has to be a part of awareness raising among people who want to change something, that they don't fall for these false promises, really. So I think it's a really important aspect of every campaign. I think that to know that sustainable aviation is not possible regarding this growth rate we have right now of flying. So yeah, I think it will be not easy. Of course, there's also a lot of lobbying, but we can also use events like ICAO, the ICAO meeting in Montreal, for example, that was in September, to mobilize, to use these events to mobilize, to get people to talk about these false promises of the aviation industry, and to really get them active around these events, for example, where the aviation industry tries to set the agenda and to have some kind of counter narrative really pushing forward. I think it is an important part of every campaign. I think I totally agree with you.
Maybe if I may add something too. Actually, it's very interesting to see that already within some industry communication, the demand prognoses are going down because of what they see in the civil society and the changes of the image of flying. So actually they're downscaling some of their demand prognosis. And also something very interesting that I read was somebody being quoted that it's even hard to get qualified workers because people with industry degrees don't want to work in a polluting sector. So this is already happening. It's already reaching the aviation industry, what is happening on the political level. But at the same time, of course, that can become tough. Like there's this saying from, I think it's credited to Gandhi, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you will win. And at our last Stay Grounded Network meeting, we also invited somebody from Taming Aviation, which was also a European-wide campaign where a lot of citizen initiatives joined together to actually trying to reduce aviation. And they were faced with heavy discreditory measures and communication by ICAO and by aviation industry actors. So I think, yeah, it's a very valid point that we also have to be aware that once we get like a real campaign going, and once we are perceived as a very powerful challenger of the aviation industry, there will be, of course, more counter action too, and that's something to have in mind, I think. But it is also a sign that you're actually disturbing. So it's it's a good sign too, I think.
Yeah, so since we are nearly finished with our time, I will just make a quick wrap up, and also there will be a feedback form I would really like to fill out before you all leave. So I will post that in the chat. It just takes 3 minutes to fill that out, so yeah, it would be really great. I did only send it to Christian, sorry. Not to everyone. Yeah. So just a quick wrap up, a short summary of what happened now in the webinar. So Vivian was so nice to give us a short insight into the theories of environmental psychology, where she talked about discrepancies between attitudes and behavior, the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, and also the different obstacles that you can describe from a psychological point of view for people that want to give up flying. And also on social norms, and also on hints that on how psychology can contribute to behavior change initiatives. Yeah, we will also share the material that Vivian was relating to in our blog post that I will send you in some days. So there will be enough material to read afterwards too. Yeah, Lars has started his presentation with a critique of certain approaches to behavior change, and he outlined the concepts of practice theory, also explaining the different elements that are part of it, and also gave an example of how approach could look like in a campaign. And yeah, as you still can remember, I guess I have given a presentation on the new campaign and how we want to integrate different approaches and try to connect the different pillars of our campaign. Yeah, I'm happy if you have feedback for us on this issue. It's still work in progress. We are experimenting with it, of course, like every campaign is an experiment. So we are really looking forward to your input to it. And if you have any ideas or literature or anything you want us to help with, we are very happy to receive it. Yeah, I think we can close the webinar now. Lars and Vivian, do you want to have some final words before we close?
Yeah, just thanks a lot for this really interesting conversation, and I hope that we will also talk in the future, because I would really like to stay in the network and know what's happening, and I wish you good luck.
Yeah, well, yeah, let's not just stay grounded, but also stay connected.
Thank you. Great closing words. Let's stay connected and continue the discussion on behavior and system change. So have a nice evening to you all. You will all receive a mail from me in some days. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.